any of you want to join the children in that memory verse, I'd encourage you to do so. Memorizing scriptures is not just for the youngest of us, but we could all use it. We are moving on from our origin stories and our 52 key stories in the Bible, from which we learned about not only the origin of the universe, but also our broken relationship with God, to those stories that begin to tell the beginning of how God is working to restore that relationship with Him that got broken. As I concluded last week, some of those stories that we're not really covering, like Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel, all affirm how man's godlike ability to know about good and evil, and his desire to be more like God, and his penchant for choosing evil over God, further deteriorate his relationship, not only with each other, but particularly that relationship with God. And in God's response to what we were calling man's rebellion in those stories, I don't know if you noticed those responses, but they don't look like an attempt for God to redeem His people. Especially the story about the flood. That's one of those stories that, we decorate our children's rooms with. We like the ark and all those kinds of stuff, but it's a pretty horrific story. God doesn't like man because of the things he's doing. There's only Noah and a few of his family that are righteous, and he destroys everyone else with his flood. Sometimes when I've talked about that, when I said, man, there's this thing called the Lego Bible, and you should illustrate it, and if they're trying to do stories, if you haven't seen it, you ought to look it up sometime. And particularly in that story, because they have these little parts of Lego guys out in the water that are, they die. It doesn't look like God is interested in redeeming those people. But I wanted to bring that up to remind you that God is a God of grace and love, and He even gave those people another chance. If you don't know, Peter in his letter said that Jesus preached to the souls in prison who died in the days of Noah. They actually get another chance to hear the gospel. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked into telling that story today, but I just wanted to bring it up as a way of reminding you that God is always at work at redeeming and loving the world. And sometimes we hear some of these Old Testament stories and we think, that sounds like a different God of the New Testament. But He's the same God with the same love, and He expresses it in the same ways, ultimately. It seems to me, from what the Bible records of those stories, that man's acquisition of the knowledge of good and evil really hasn't been that great of a benefit. I have always thought that there should have been another tree in the garden. I always thought it would be great if there was a tree in the garden that if you ate the fruit from it, that you would always do good and never do evil. I thought that's the kind of thing He should have put there. And then He should have told us, no, don't eat from that one, because we would have done it. That's probably why I'm not in charge of things. I'd get it all backwards and wrong. That tree of obedience just doesn't exist. It's not that Adam and Eve's descendants never did anything good, as we hear the stories that unfold. They did a lot of good things. Sometimes they really got it right. It's not like love was absent from their lives, or they could never do something that was beneficial or kind, but their lives were not defined by love as it would have been had they listened to God and followed Him and took up His ways. While most of them didn't retain the knowledge of God, some of them did. There is always this remnant of people among Adam's and Eve's descendants who held on to their relationship with God and who longed to live His ways and who longed to see their world change as a result of it. The story of redemption begins with an unlikely hero whose family came from that remnant. His name was Abram, which meant Father high above. That's what Abram means in their language. His faults are glaring as this story unfolds, but his faith in God is resolute. We read the verses 1 through 3 in Genesis 12 earlier, but I want to begin by reading the next verses, 4 through 12. 4 through 9. I keep saying 12. 4 through 9. Chapter 12. Each week we're going to hear a large portion of Scripture that's part of the stories that we're learning. Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the side of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. We learn in this story that it was God who first approaches Abram with an offer. God is always taking the first step. He's always the one who's coming to us. Now, we don't know how God appeared to Abram. I'll get his name mixed up now. But he was able to make his intention clear to him. We don't know if it was an apparition or in a dream or God appeared to him in some way. It just doesn't tell us that part of the story, although we have questions about it. He tells Abram what he is going to do for him and through his descendants, and what Abram would need to do if he wanted God to make those things happen. We learn that Abram did want those things to happen. Usually when God makes an offer to us, it's always an attractive offer. The part of the attraction for Abram was success. He was going to be blessed. He was, by blessing back then, they thought, man, I'm going to have more and more and more. I'm going to be well off. God continues that, and not only would he be successful, but he would leave a legacy. Those are pretty potent motives, especially when you consider that Abram and Sarai, his wife, were childless. The desire to be part of fulfilling God's command to be fruitful and multiply ran very deep within them. Now, those who feel that way and who don't have children really long for it. And they often wonder why God hasn't blessed them like so many other people who have been blessed in that same way. God doesn't spell it out to them in these initial blessings in this call of Abram, but he does hint that there's going to be this child that comes for he and his wife. Now, Abram's decision to pack up everything and move to this distant land is probably viewed by everyone else, even though we're not told about it, except for his wife and his nephew Lot, as maybe a little bit crazy. I don't know if you've ever known someone who says, God told me I just need to leave everything and go here. Some people I've known who've done that. In fact, we've got some people in our church right now who are kind of in the process of that kind of a thing, saying, hey, I need to be somewhere else, and I'm just going to sell my house. I don't know where I'm going to be next, and I'm going to be taking this next thing, and I'm just going to trust that God is really going to lead me. There are people who are trying to live an Abrahamic kind of faith that way. And there's a part of us, when we hear about that, we're like, have you thought this through? Are you sure about that? That doesn't sound like you planned very well. I don't know what's going to be happening next. But, well, it's hard to leave whenever you think that a bad situation, right? We can understand when someone wants to leave when things are not well. There's troubles and there's sorrows and whatever. You're just trying to escape a bad situation. But they were leaving a good situation. Everything was going well in Haran. We learn in this story that in order for Abram to go, to keep his part of the offer, he has to leave some very good things behind. He has to leave his homeland. I don't know about you, but if I thought about traveling or going or being somewhere else, it's usually within my homeland. Well, maybe I'll go to this other state or I'll go to this other place. I don't think about going to a different homeland. There's some sense of security about being with the people and the culture we understand, even if we have odds against it. he has to leave his relatives. And some relatives you probably don't mind never seeing again, but this gives the impression that there are these people who are part of his life that he enjoys, and they live life together, and he's going to have to leave that behind. And then his house, and that's not necessarily talking about the exact house structure itself, but everything that goes around with being in one place. Most of us here in Los Alamos are not generationally from this one place, but there are places around where there are just like generations upon generations of family that are sort of living in this one place, and everybody has that sense of being together, and you have to leave that behind. Some of those could be good things. It's one thing to leave a bad situation, like I said, it's a little more difficult to leave a good situation. It would be hard to leave a good life for an unknown with the prospect that it could, might be better. At least God said that it would. I want you to understand that when Abram left, it was no easy thing for him to do. Can you imagine? Your spouse comes home one day and says, "Hey, I'm quitting the job. We're going to get up. God told me that we're going to go to this unknown place, and life is going to be better there than it is here. I know things are good here. Everything is working. This is a perfect place, but God has a better place for us." You might, if you believe, as Abram had experienced, that God had appeared to you and he spoke clearly and directly to you, you might go if that happened. But for most of us, we're always not so sure if it's really God speaking and what is he really giving to us. But Abram had this direct communication with God. And so we learn in the chapters leading up to Abram's call, which we didn't read together, that Abram came from a long line of believers. He was part of that remnant. And I'm sure they handed down stories about God and the amazing things that he had done and the faithfulness that he had shown himself. That had to be part of their growing up and what they would know about him. Whatever those stories were, they were enough for Abram to know and trust God whenever he shows up. And because of this long spiritual heritage, he is prepared to step out in faith. Now, when he steps out in faith, I'm sure you notice this part, he was 75 years old. That's pretty old to begin a new adventure in life. He was already older than his father when his father died. His father died around 72. You're really never too old to begin a new adventure if God is the one who's leading you. Now, before we look at the story of what Abraham did in response, his response of faith, I want to revisit what God promised him. I want you to think about what God had promised this old man who had outlived his father, who was childless. God promised to make Abram a great nation. He promised to bless him. He promised to make his name great. He promised to make him a blessing to others. God promised that he would bless those who blessed him and curse those who cursed him. And God promised that through him all families of the earth would be blessed. Those are some pretty amazing promises. It says a lot, but man, there are a lot of things that it's not real clear about. And all Abram had to do was go to this land that God would show him. Now, you may not realize this, but the land that God was going to show him just happened to be the exact same land that Abram's father, Terah, had set out for, the land of Canaan. That's earlier in some of these texts. So Abram's real starting point for this journey was down in the city of Ur. It was a very wealthy city. It sat on the Euphrates River down by the Persian Gulf. Terah, we were told, took Abram and his wife Sarah and Lot. Lot's father, if you didn't know, Abraham's brother, had died. And so he's kind of like the adopted nephew into the family. Abram's other brother, Nahor, and his family remained in Ur. We're not told what motivated Terah to take this part of his family and head for the land of Canaan, only that he did so. We know that they followed the Euphrates north all the way up into the mountains near the headwaters, and they ended up on a tributary in a town of Haran. It was a lush place. It was a place where there was a plenty at. It's where part of the stories of it is talk about the Garden of Eden that we covered not too long ago. It was supposed to be up in that direction. We don't know why they ended up stopping halfway there. Only that it was so nice, it was so good, that they settled down and they put down their roots before getting to where they were headed. But now, because of God's new offer, Abraham would finish the journey on which his father had originally set out. We learn from the story that Abram fully trusted God to keep his promises. So that's something we relate to. Like Abram, we hold on to God's promises to us. I don't know if you know what God's promises are, but it used to be very popular to sort of crystallize those promises into a little booklet. We have several in my office. It's God's little promise book. And instead of all of the scriptures, it's just those little scriptures that talk about things that God has promised to us, his people. And we often take those and we kind of use them as something that helps us get through those difficult times in our lives. When life is less than wonderful, we look forward with anticipation for those good things that God said will come, trusting that he will bring them about despite the opposition we seem to be facing, despite the mess of life we may have made of it. And we just say, God, I don't know how you're going to bring about some of these promises. They just seem unreal, but I'm going to trust that you're going to do that. And we begin to make choices in our lives based on those promises. You know, making decisions in those everyday parts of your lives based on what God said he is going to do is called faith. You act on it today, even though it's not happening yet. I've always found it interesting that Abram stepping out in faith was not a solo event. Abram took his wife, Sarah, his nephew, Lot, but he also took all of their persons, which were servants, some say were slaves, that they had acquired while they were in Haran. They also took all of their livestock, and evidently they were pretty wealthy, and they had a lot of livestock that those slaves probably were taking care of, and it says they took all of their possessions. I want to bring that up because they look more like a migrating caravan than a family on a camping trip. They weren't just packing up their suitcase and, heading to the next state for a few days. They were loaded up with everything. Canaan was south of Haran toward the Mediterranean Sea, about 400 miles away. Even if they were to take it on the average speed of a caravan, which is about 10 miles a day, at least from what I read this last week, it would have taken them at least 40 days to get there, and that's if they were really pushing it. So it probably took longer. But the emphasis of this story is not on how fast they got there, but on how they followed God to get there, step by step and day by day, until they arrived at that promised land. And that's usually how we get to the realization of God's promises, is by that faithful daily walking with him. But the story of God keeping his promises doesn't end at their arrival in Canaan. They kept right on traveling into the land. That's what our scripture tells us. It was when they stopped near Shechem, which is kind of midway into Canaan, by the Oak of Moreh, that God appears to Abram again. Again, we don't know how he does that. He just does. He knows it's God. And he is told that, hey, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. So there's that promise of an ancestry, of a child, of something that's lacking in his life right now. In response, Abram makes an altar and he worships God. But he doesn't stay there. He doesn't stay at that moment. He keeps going south. The next stop, we're told, was on the mountain east of Bethel, which is near where Jerusalem would have been. We're told that Abram built another altar and worshiped there too. But he doesn't stay there either. He keeps heading south. He gets down in what we know as the Judean wilderness area today, which is where the Negev is. And he doesn't stay there. He keeps going south of it. And then we get this verse that's in the next chapter that says that there was a famine. Of course, that's also sort of a desert area, but there's this famine that's going on, and so he keeps going south. He goes right through the promised land and out of the promised land and down into Egypt. It's kind of like, don't you know when to stop, Abram? There's some place that you should have. He just keeps going down there. And then over the next 9 chapters in Genesis, we're told of Abram's adventures of getting back to the promised land. He just keeps it, he just goes right on through it. And there are tales from those chapters that inspire obedience. We often share them in children's messages because we want our children to gain a foundation of faith. There's also warnings in those stories that encourage caution about being sucked into the ways of the world. It's sort of a travelogue of sorts, a spiritual faith travelogue. And I want to give you the highlight of that adventure. We're told that once they got near to Egypt, Abram quit being so faithful and started being more fearful. And sometimes in our journey to God's promises, sometimes we're motivated by fear more than faith. He actually orders his wife, and they were in agreement on this. He says, hey, you know how things work. We're going to get close to Egypt, and Pharaoh is going to take a look at you, and he's going to want you for his wife. And that means he's probably going to knock me off so that he can have you, because then you'd be free. And I don't want that to happen. And so when we get close, you just say that you're my sister, which we find out later was true. They were brother and sister. Terah was both of their fathers, but they were born to different mothers. I'm not going to get into right or wrong about all that, but it's just the way it was. They really were brother and sisters. They weren't lying. They just were kind of stretching the truth a little bit. They weren't saying we're husband and wife because of that fear. So, you're right. Pharaoh looks at her, and remember, they're old, so she must have been a good-looking lady in her old age for Pharaoh to say, hey, I want that girl as my wife. She's looking good. And so he takes her, and he's going to say, I'm going to make her wife. He sort of makes almost like a dowry exchange to Abraham. He gets livestock, he gets slaves, he gets all kinds of stuff to sort of pay for his sister to be his wife. And God has to bail him out. God says, this really wasn't my plan. And so he brings about a plague against Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has to go to Abraham and figures out that, hey, it's your wife. You've lied to me. What's going on here? And he basically, some of those promises that God said he was going to do sort of take place. He is blessed. His wealth grows. And he gets sent back north. It's kind of like you went too far, and now Pharaoh's going, out of here. You got to go back to the Negev. Sends him on his way, even sends some of his people to make sure he gets there. When they get back to the lower part of the promised land, Abram and Lot's herds have been so blessed that they can't even graze in the same place without it sort of being a scorched earth policy. They just wipe everything out. And they're like, man, we can't do this. You need to go one way. I'm going to go another way. And their herdsmen were sort of feuding and fighting with one another. And he said, Lot, you just choose wherever you want to go. He saw this lush, green area. He says, hey, I want to go down and live in this area. So Abram's great. I'll go off this other direction. And so they go. Now, when you show up in a new land, man, with that many people and that much herds and that kind of stuff, you get noticed. And we're told on their journey back to the promised land that they get to the promised land just in time for wars to break out. There's a lot of local kings in the area, and they're warring with one another. And Abram tries to avoid it. He doesn't really want to get caught up in the middle of all of this fighting. I don't even know if he understands who's on whose side. He sort of takes his people and he starts finding a place where he doesn't have to get caught up into it. And then someone shows up and he says, hey, Lot that went the other direction, he got caught up in it. He and his family got captured and they're being taken off to be slaves to the north. And Abram's going like, great. And so he enters into the fray of the wars. Now, just to let you know how blessed he's being in this time and how God is keeping his promises to him, it says that Abram can send to rescue Lot 318 trained men. In other words, he's got his own little army going. In addition to being able to keep all his herds and stuff like this, he's becoming a nation. And he goes up. He's blessed with a victory. And on his way back, that's when he meets Melchizedek, and he has this encounter of worship. And then the ones who were not a part of that said, oh, hey, you guys, we wouldn't mind you being around here. He sort of accepted into the land on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You just went up there and wiped out those guys? Come and be a friend with us, and maybe you don't wipe us out too. It was about that time that Abram is told unmistakably by God that he will have a son by his own body as his own heir. Just, hey, I want you to understand this is what's going to happen. But when Abram hears that, it just sounds impossible. I mean, he's really old now. And Sarah might look good, but she's past the age of having kids. And so instead of trusting God to do the impossible, they take matters into their own hands. And Sarai gives a young Egyptian servant that she has to Abraham to bear a son. She does. She bears a son to him. But it's not the child of promise. We learn that things never go well when we replace the impossible nature of God's promises with possible ones that we can achieve. Because it's usually not what God wants. You'll have to read all the troubles that created. You can imagine. Most of you probably know the story, but I encourage you to go back and read it for yourself again. It's a story of jealousy and resentment, pride, unfaithfulness. And it wasn't until after that unfaithful fiasco that God comes to Abraham again. And he reaffirms his promise to him that he is going to give him a son. He needs to wait. It's then that God changes his name from Abram to Abraham, which means the father of many nations. To assure Abraham that God is going to keep his promise, God enters into a covenant with Abraham. Not that God needed to keep his promises, but Abram doesn't seem to be able to hold on to his side very well. And covenants affirm and remind us that we can trust the other person. And there was this elaborate ceremony that took place. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but it was pretty pungent of a ceremony, very vivid and graphic, and of what's going to happen through it. And then at the end of it, Abram was given a sign that he was to bear as a reminder that God was going to keep his promises to him and his offspring. And that sign was circumcision. And it was going to be for Abram and for his descendants. They needed this sort of reminder because it was going to be a long time before God kept that last promise to bless the nations through the earth through him. And like we were saying earlier during communion time, sometimes we forget without some reminder. And so there was this reminder of the covenant that God had kept to them, that it would be unmistakable. You know, if you're circumcised, they were using that circumcision to remind them that God is going to keep his promises. That's what that was about. It was a reminder for Abraham and for his descendants. It was after that God happened to bring his judgment down on Sodom and Gomorrah, which happened to be the place where Lot had taken his place. Abraham finds out about it, and he tries to haggle with God in the hope of saving his nephew, which he didn't really need to do because God wasn't going to off the nephew anyways. It's another story that ends up reminding us that we need God to save us even from the judgments of the things that we deserve. And then sort of, we kind of move from that story in which God saves Lot and he destroys the Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's sort of, at least for this section of the story, this travel log finally comes to an end. And most of us are usually by that time in the story, we're going like, it's about time. I'm tired of hearing about the story. It's, come on, let's get on to the action. It's then, after that Abram and Sarah gets a new name as well, to have their child of promise. They finally get Isaac, whose name's Laughter, because whenever Sarah, by that time, hears that she's going to be the mother of a real child in that old age, she laughs. And that's when things with her and this former slave who has the other son by Abraham gets even worse. The turmoil just becomes unbearable for both of them, and they have to be separated. It's not a pretty separation, and one that's worth looking at to remind us of all the things that can be unintended consequences whenever we take matters into our own hands. After things are settled, Abram moves further into the promised land where he was supposed to stay to start with. He pulls the same faithless trick of moving into this area because there's this king of that area that he's afraid of. He's afraid he'll see Sarah and he'll want to take her. And so he says, hey, act like my sister. And she does, and he takes her, with the result that the king finds out again. But this time, Abram works out a peace treaty with his king, and they finally settle in the land of Canaan. That's all the way up through chapter 21 of Genesis. And when we hear these stories of the beginning of redemption, we hear a repetitive kind of nature to them. God always shows himself faithful. God always keeps his promises. But even the father of faith has those unfaithful moments when he just makes a mess of things. But even when we make a mess of things, God can use those for good. He can use even those things to bring about his will. And he will keep his promise. It's the beginning of the story of redemption. And I'll be honest, you don't really need to know the story of the beginning of redemption, but you do need to know the story of how God kept that promise of blessing all nations, because we receive that blessing today. It's the blessing that comes through the offer of forgiveness of our sins, to repair that broken relationship through his son Jesus, who makes peace with us on the cross. And that's the part of the story we want to get to. But there's a beginning to it. God all along has loved the world, and he continues to make that offer to us. And so I wanted to remind you of that this morning. Wherever you're at and whatever is going on in your life, if you wonder where God is at, I'll tell you. He's close, and he's near, and he knows what's going on, and he's keeping his promises to you.